hand clamped down on Josie's wrist and yanked hard. She got pulled out from behind the bar, the drink tray slipping from her fingers and shattering across the tile floor. The man shoved her into the corner wall, blocked her path with his whole body, his face so close she could smell the cheap mint on his breath. The silver chain around Josie's neck snapped in the struggle. The locket broke free, hit the floor, rolled a few inches, and stopped right under his heel. Inside that locket was a photo of her brother, the only piece of her family she still carried with her everywhere. He stepped on it without even knowing. 15 people in that bar saw everything, every second of it, every choked sound caught in her throat, and not a single one of them moved. A construction worker at the window table half stood up, then sat back down when the guy turned his head and looked at him. That moment hurt worse than getting shoved into a wall, because somebody almost helped and then chose not to. Then, in the far back corner of the bar, where the light barely reached, a man was signing his check. The pen stopped mid-signature. He looked up. The pen dropped to the table. Barrett Ashford. Dark suit, shoulders wide enough to fill the booth, a jawline cut sharp, eyes so dark they were almost black, the kind of eyes people didn't want to look into for too long. The guy pinning Josie against the wall had no idea he was there. He'd just picked the worst room on earth to do this in. But hold on. Stop right here. You need to understand this room before you understand what Barrett did. If this story's worth hearing, hit that like button so more people get to hear it. Share it with someone who needs to remember that standing up always matters, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The Meridian Bar sat on an empty stretch of road on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, the kind of place you could drive past 10 times before realizing it was there. The tin roof sagged slightly in the middle. The neon sign with the letter M flickered weakly as if it were about to go out, but never truly did, and the wooden door had been pushed open so many times that the hinges groaned every time someone stepped through. Inside, the ceiling fans turned so slowly they were almost useless. The tile floor was cracked in lines running every which way that no one had bothered to repair, and the television hanging in the corner was showing a soccer match that not a single eye in the bar cared enough to glance at. It was Thursday night, the kind of night when the Meridian was only a few people more crowded than it was during the day, and everything moved slowly, as if time itself were tired. By the window, a few construction workers with cement dust still on their pant legs sat around a round table. In the corner booth, a middle-aged couple sat in the silence of two people who had been together long enough to understand each other without speaking. Against the wall on the right, an old man in a faded veteran's cap sat drinking alone, his back slightly bent but his eyes still bright, the kind of eyes that had seen too much but had never stopped looking. At the table in the middle of the bar, 3 young women sat close together, their laughter mixed with the background music leaking from the old speaker. And behind the bar, Pauline, 58 years old, stood polishing a glass with the same towel she had used on 1,000 glasses before it. Pauline knew the name of every regular, knew what each person drank, knew who was sad but didn't want to say it, and knew when to ask and when to leave someone alone. She had stood behind that counter for almost 20 years, long enough to understand that most nights in a bar were the same, and long enough to recognize immediately when a night was about to become different from the others. But that evening, she didn't recognize it. No one did. It was only a Thursday night at the Meridian, ordinary enough to be boring, quiet enough to make a person sleepy. No one in that room knew that within 2 hours, that creaking wooden door would become the line between fear and courage, and every one of them would have to choose which side they stood on. Barrett Ashford sat in the last corner booth of the Meridian Bar, the way he did every Thursday night. Same seat, same glass, whiskey neat, no ice, and the same posture he had carried into every room he had entered for the past 15 years. Back against the wall, eyes on the door. It wasn't a habit. It was instinct. The kind of instinct shaped by a life where turning your back to a door could be the last time you ever turned your back on anything. He was 33 years old, but the way he sat, the way he watched, the way his eyes moved across every face in the bar without his head needing to turn, all of it made him look like a man who had lived twice that long. Dark suit, tie never loosened, not even in a bar with cracked tile floors on the outskirts of Savannah at 9 o'clock at night. Some men wore suits because the work required it, and some men wore suits because it was the only armor they allowed the world to see. Barrett belonged to the second kind. The staff knew him. Pauline knew him. But knowing, here, didn't mean understanding. It meant having learned exactly how much distance to keep. When Barrett walked in, Pauline gave him a nod, brought his whiskey to the table without needing to ask, then left him alone. She didn't linger, didn't make small talk. Not because she was afraid, but because she recognized that he came here to be left in peace, and she respected that in the way of someone who had served long enough to tell the difference between a customer who wanted conversation and a customer who wanted silence. One of the construction workers by the window, a man new to the area, glanced toward Barrett for the third time, then leaned over and asked Pauline as she passed, "Who's that guy?" Pauline didn't stop walking. "He likes quiet," she said, just loud enough to be heard. "Best leave him to it." The construction worker looked at Barrett one more time, at the broad shoulders filling the corner booth, at the dark eyes, almost black, watching the door without looking at anyone in particular, and decided Pauline was right. Barrett tipped generously every time, 3 times the price of the drink, never caused trouble, never came with anyone. He came, he drank, he paid, and he left. The Meridian Bar was the only place where Barrett Ashford allowed himself not to be Barrett Ashford. No men waiting outside the door, no calls that needed answering, no decisions that had to be made. Only 1 glass of whiskey and the quiet of a room where no one knew what he truly was. But tonight, on the way to the Meridian, his phone buzzed. A message from one of his men, brief as always. There was a ring operating on territory he controlled, targeting the elderly and the vulnerable, using medical debt and forged paperwork to take their homes. The man behind it was named Hugh Pendleton. Barrett read the message, registered the name, then turned off the screen. Not a priority yet. His territory was wide, the problems were many, and a strange name and a Thursday night message wasn't enough to make him change his routine. He slid the phone into his pocket, drove to the Meridian, took his seat in the corner booth, and ordered his whiskey as he always did. He didn't yet know that the name in that message would walk through the door of this bar before the night was over, and that everything he thought he had left outside the Meridian's door would find its way inside and sit right in front of him. While Barrett Ashford sat still in his dark corner with his whiskey, on the other side of the bar, Josie Morrow was doing what she did every night, serving, smiling, and trying to become invisible. 27 years old, brown hair tied low at the nape of her neck, gray eyes, the kind of eyes that, if you looked long enough, didn't hold sadness so much as the exhaustion of someone who had been sad for so long that sadness had become normal. She smiled at customers when she brought drinks to their tables, but that smile never reached her eyes. It stopped at her lips, completed its duty, then disappeared the moment she turned away. Josie moved lightly, always lightly, as if she had learned very early that the less people noticed her, the less trouble found her. She brought drinks to the construction workers, cleared glasses for the middle-aged couple, nodded to the old man in the veteran's cap, and returned behind the bar without leaving any mark on the air of the room. Pauline was wiping down the counter when Josie set the tray down. She glanced at her, the kind of quick but careful look only people used to worrying about others possessed, then asked quietly, her voice low enough that no one but the 2 of them could hear, "Did that man come by again today?" Josie shook her head, but her hand tightened harder around the towel, her knuckles turning white, and Pauline saw it. She also saw the old bruise on Josie's wrist, the one Josie always hid with long sleeves even though the bar was hot in the Georgia autumn, the one Pauline never asked about because she knew Josie would never answer. Around Josie's neck, a thin silver chain glimmered every time she bent down to pour a drink. The small locket hanging from that chain was the one thing Josie never took off. Inside was a picture of Caleb, her younger brother, wide smile, bright eyes, taken at his happiest moment before he was gone forever. Caleb had died from an opioid overdose 2 years earlier, the kind of medication a doctor prescribed after a minor surgery, and then no one bothered to follow up when he couldn't stop taking it. Her mother collapsed after Caleb's death, and 1 year later, she followed him. Josie dropped out of medical school because there was no one left to pay the tuition, no one left to go home and tell stories to, and not enough strength left to pretend the future still meant anything. All that remained of her family was the small house her mother had left behind on the outskirts, where Caleb had once run barefoot through the backyard, where her mother had once sat reading by the window every afternoon, and now someone was trying to take that house away from her. Josie stood behind the bar, polishing a glass that had been clean for a long time, while her other hand rose to touch the locket lightly against her chest. Her lips moved, whispering softly enough that only she and Caleb could hear. "I'll keep the house, Caleb," I promised. The bell on the wooden door jingled, and Josie looked up by reflex the way she did whenever a new customer came in. The man who stepped inside looked nothing like anyone who usually came to the Meridian. 40 years old, a neatly pressed white shirt tucked into dress pants, a heavy watch on his left wrist, the kind of watch Josie's entire month's pay would not be enough to buy even the strap. He had a wide smile, the kind of smile worn by insurance salesmen knocking on your door on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of smile you saw, and something in your instincts told you not to invite this person into your house, even if you could not explain why. Craig Dutton. He stepped through the door of the Meridian bar, as if he were entering a 5-star restaurant waiting for his reserved table, and he did not start trouble right away. That was what made him more dangerous than men who started trouble right away. He sat down at the bar, right where Josie was working, and ordered a bourbon in a pleasant voice. He smiled at Josie, asked whether the bar was busy tonight, complimented the slow-turning ceiling fan, then joked that it was probably as lazy as he was on Thursdays. Josie poured the drink, set it in front of him, and did not smile back. She recognized him, not in the way a person recognizes someone they have met, but in the way a person recognizes a name they have heard, a phone number that has called at midnight, letters written in a polite voice that still leave you sleepless after reading them. Behind the bar, Pauline caught sight of the strange man, and also caught the way Josie's body went rigid for one brief second before she pretended to be normal. But the man sat still, drank his bourbon, made small talk, and Pauline told herself, maybe it was fine. Maybe he was only a traveler stopping in. She turned away to polish a glass, and missed the moment everything changed. When Josie turned her back to the bar to pour another drink, Dutton slid a white envelope across the counter, gently, without a sound. Like a man pushing the final card in a poker game he knew he had already won. Josie turned back, looked at the envelope, then looked at Dutton. He nodded toward it, still wearing that smile. "Open it, Miss Morrow." Josie opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of her mother's house, the small white-painted house on the outskirts where she had grown up, where Caleb had once hung a hammock on the porch, where her mother had once planted hydrangeas along the walkway. Beneath the photograph was one line of neat handwriting. "Sold. Move out by Monday." Josie's hand froze on the photograph. Dutton took a sip of bourbon and began to speak, his voice still gentle, still polite, as if he were explaining an administrative procedure rather than stripping away the last thing she had. Her mother's medical debt, he said. The unpaid hospital bills from the final months now belonged to her under inheritance law. She had signed the papers, he reminded her, 3 months earlier, at the office of the man she had thought was a financial counselor. The paper she had believed was an application for a payment extension, but was actually a transfer of ownership for the house. "It was done," he said, black and white. Her signature at the bottom line. He said all of it without once raising his voice, without once striking the counter with his hand, without one word that anyone could call a threat, if they only listened and did not see Josie's face slowly draining of all color. It was the most refined kind of threat, the kind that, when you retold it to someone else, did not sound frightening at all. But if you were the one sitting there, if you were the one looking at a photograph of your mother's house in the hands of a stranger, you understood that politeness could sometimes be the cruelest weapon. Josie stared at the photograph for a long time, at the white roof where the paint was peeling slightly at one corner, at the hydrangeas her mother had planted, at the porch where Caleb had once spent whole summers lying and reading comic books. Then she did something Craig Dutton did not expect. She held the photograph with both hands and tore it in half right in front of him. Not one word. No screaming, no crying. Only the two halves of the photograph falling onto the counter, and her gray eyes looking straight into his. And in those eyes there was not the fear Dutton was used to seeing in the people he threatened, but something he had no tool to deal with. The silence of a person who had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to fear losing. Dutton's face changed. The broad smile narrowed, his eyes hardened, and the layer of politeness peeled away in strips like old paint under rain. He was used to people crying. He was used to people begging. He was used to people trembling as they signed one more paper in the hope of being left alone. He was not used to someone looking straight into his eyes and tearing apart the thing he had just placed in front of her. And that was the moment Craig Dutton decided that politeness had stopped working, the exact same moment you witnessed at the very beginning of this story. A hand clamping down on her wrist, a tray of glasses shattering on the floor, the girl shoved into the corner of the wall, the locket ripped from her neck and rolling under the man's heel. You already know that part. But there is something you do not know. After Dutton pinned Josie against the wall, after the entire bar froze and no one moved, He did something no one in that room expected. He did not yell. He did not strike her. With his other hand, he searched the pocket of Josie's apron, calmly, like a man looking for spare change in his coat pocket, and pulled out a small set of keys. 3 keys on a silver key ring, the keys to the house Josie had sworn to Caleb she would keep. Dutton held the keys up in front of her, shook them lightly so they jingled, then slipped them into his pants pocket. "Locks have already been changed," he said, his voice still so calm it was frightening. "These keys are useless now. Even if you go home, you won't be able to get inside." Josie heard that sentence and did not cry. She had heard too many sentences like it in her life. Sentences designed to make her smaller, to remind her that she had no power, that she was only a 27-year-old girl, with no one standing behind her, and that the world could take anything it wanted from her hands. She did not cry because of the sentence. But then her eyes dropped to the floor, and she saw the locket. It lay there beneath Dutton's heel. Its face sprung open, Caleb's picture glinting under the bar lights. His smile, the smile of an 18-year-old boy preserved in time, was lying under the soul of a man who did not know who he was and did not care who he was. Josie screamed. Not a scream of fear, not a scream of pain. It was the scream of a person seeing the holiest thing in her life being crushed under the foot of a stranger and being unable to do anything about it. That scream rang through the whole bar, through the background music, through the cowardly silence of 15 people trying to pretend they saw nothing, and it reached 2 people. The first was the old man in the veteran's cap, the man who had been sitting alone and drinking all evening. He set his glass down, looked straight at Dutton, and said loudly, his voice trembling but clear, "Hey, you don't get to do that." The whole bar turned to look at him. Dutton turned too, his eyes cold, and it took only 1 sentence. "What do you want, old man?" 3 seconds. The old man looked into Dutton's eyes, looked down at the table, and went silent. His hand clenched tight on his thigh, but he stayed silent. A flicker of resistance had risen and been stamped out in 3 seconds, and the silence afterward was heavier than any silence before it, because it was no longer the silence of people who did not know what to do, but the silence of people who knew what they should do and did not have enough courage to do it. And the second person that scream reached was the man sitting in the very back corner with his cold glass of whiskey, the man who had seen the locket beneath the stranger's heel and understood what it was before anyone else in the room had time to understand. That man was Barrett Ashford. Barrett had seen everything from his booth in the farthest corner. He missed nothing. He saw the man in the expensive shirt slide the envelope across the counter. He saw the brown-haired girl tear the photograph in half without saying a word. He saw the man move around the bar, saw the tray of glasses shatter, saw her shoved into the wall. He saw him search her apron pocket, take the keys, and slip them into his pants pocket, as if he were pocketing spare change. He saw the old man in the veteran's cap try to stand up, then get crushed back down with 3 words. And he saw the locket lying on the floor beneath the man's heel, its face sprung open, the tiny photograph inside glinting under the lights. Barrett didn't know who that girl was. He didn't know who was in the photograph inside the locket. He didn't know what the house in the envelope meant, but he knew what a locket ripped from someone's neck looked like. And he knew what the face of a person looked like when they were watching the most precious thing in their life lying beneath a stranger's foot, because he had seen that face before, a very long time ago, in a very different place, and he had never been able to forget it. Barrett stood up. Not quickly, not hurriedly, not dramatically, slow and certain, like the way the tide pulls back before striking the shore. The booth creaked as his weight left it, and in the room that had gone silent with fear, that sound was clear enough that one person after another turned their head toward the back corner. Barrett stepped out of the darkness. Each footstep on the cracked tile floor sounded steady, like a countdown, and with every step he took closer, Dutton seemed to grow a little smaller. That expensive shirt, a little less expensive, that heavy watch, a little less heavy. Barrett did not say, "Let her go." He said nothing at all. He stopped 2 steps from Dutton, and instead of looking at the man, he looked down at the floor, at the locket beneath his heel. Then he did something no one in that bar expected. He bent down, gently, almost carefully, and picked the locket up from the floor. Dutton instinctively stepped back when Barrett bent near his feet, and that step back was the first thing he had done all night without calculating it first. Barrett straightened, the locket resting in his palm. He looked at it for a moment, did not open it, did not look at the photograph inside, because it was not his. and he respected that. Then he used the sleeve of his suit jacket, the sleeve of a dark, expensive jacket that anyone else would never use to wipe anything. And he cleaned the locket, wiped away the dust from the tile floor, wiped away the shoe mark, wiped away the way it had just been treated. He placed the locket on the bar counter, gently, as if setting down something fragile. Then he looked up, and those dark, almost black eyes looked straight into Craig Dutton's eyes. "You're standing on something that doesn't belong to you," Barrett said. His voice was low, slow, never rising, the kind of voice you had to be silent to hear, but once heard, couldn't be ignored. "Step away." Dutton looked at Barrett, looked him over from head to toe, then from toe to head, saw the dark suit cut neatly across shoulders wider than anyone else's in the bar, saw the sharp line of his jaw, saw the unblinking eyes, unmoving, unwavering, with nothing inside them except the cold patience of a man giving him one chance he should not waste. And for the first time that night, after walking into the Meridian bar with a confident smile and a threatening envelope, Craig Dutton was not sure who he was facing. But Dutton was the kind of man who wasn't used to backing down, not because he was brave, but because he had never met anyone who made backing down necessary. He pulled his phone from his pants pocket, turned on the camera, and pointed it straight at Barrett's face. "You want to go online?" Dutton said, his voice trying to hold on to calm but rising one note higher than before. "I have very good lawyers. They love suing people." Barrett did not look into the lens. He raised one hand, covered the face of the phone, and gently pushed it down, calm and certain, as a man closing a book he had already finished reading. "I don't go online," Barrett said, "but you should worry about what happened before you turned on the camera." That sentence hung in the air between the two men, and Dutton understood, perhaps for the first time that night, that the man standing in front of him was not the kind of man who made threats. He was the kind of man who told you what was going to happen, then let you decide whether you wanted it to happen. That was the difference. And that difference was beginning to make the heavy watch on Dutton's wrist damp with sweat. Barrett took one more step toward Dutton, only one step, but it closed the distance between them enough that Dutton had to look up to meet his face. And at that range, beneath the dim yellow lights of the Meridian bar, Dutton could clearly see what he had only sensed vaguely from a distance. There was nothing in Barrett's eyes like anyone Dutton had ever threatened before. No fear, no anger, no drunken recklessness, no passing aggression from a hot-headed man. Only the still patience of someone who was used to standing in exactly this place, facing exactly this kind of man, and already knowing how the story would end. Barrett spoke in a tone as ordinary as if he were talking about the weather outside or the price of gas that week. Not rising, not dropping, flat and certain as the tabletop. "Give Hugh Pendleton a message from me," he said. "Tell him next time he should choose his territory more carefully." The blood drained from Craig Dutton's face in the most literal sense. The name Hugh Pendleton left Barrett Ashford's mouth like a bullet Dutton had not seen fired. He stood there, still holding his phone, sweat soaking through the expensive fabric of his shirt, and he understood that he had miscalculated completely. The man standing in front of him was not some decent drunk interfering in a stranger's business. This man knew his boss's name. This man said the word territory, like someone who owned territory. And Dutton, with all the calculation and false politeness he had used all night, suddenly realized he had not walked into a bar that belonged to no one. He had walked into someone's bar, and that someone was standing right in front of him. Dutton said nothing more. "No, this isn't over. No, you'll regret this." Not one final threat to save face. He backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving Barrett, his back hitting the wooden door before he pushed it open and disappeared into the darkness outside. The door slammed shut behind him. The bell jingled, then fell silent. The whole Meridian bar exhaled at once. The kind of exhale you do not know you have been holding until it is over. The background music from the old speaker suddenly became audible again. The ceiling fan turned once more. The world returned to normal, or at least pretended to. Barrett did not watch Dutton leave. He turned toward the bar, stepped behind it as naturally as if he had stood there 100 times before, took a clean towel, dipped it into the ice water, wrung it lightly, and placed it on the counter right beside where Josie was sitting. He did not say, "Are you all right?" He did not ask her name. He did not touch her. He only placed the cold towel there, then turned and walked back to the last corner booth as if nothing had happened. Pauline, who had stood frozen behind the bar for the past several minutes, blinked as if waking from a dream, then moved quickly to Josie. She bent down and picked up the locket from the counter where Barrett had placed it. The chain was broken, but the locket itself was intact. She opened it, looked at the small photograph inside, the smile of a young boy, then closed it carefully and placed it in Josie's palm. Josie closed her fingers around the locket, holding it tightly as if holding the hand of someone long gone. And for the first time since Dutton had walked into the bar, her shoulders dropped. Not much, only a little, but enough for Pauline to notice. In the last corner booth, Barrett sat down, lifted his whiskey that had gone completely cold, then set it down without drinking. He took out his phone, dialed a number, and when the person on the other end answered, he said exactly 3 sentences, his voice low and concise, like a man reading a grocery list. "Pendleton is operating on my ground. Pull his full file and everyone connected to him. Call me back in 1 hour." He ended the call, put the phone back into his pocket, and looked toward the bar door. The door Dutton had just vanished through. The door Barrett knew, with the instinct that had kept him alive for 15 years, would open again tonight. Because men like Dutton did not decide to retreat on their own. They retreated to ask the person who paid them. And the person who paid them would not retreat. 15 minutes passed and nothing happened. 15 minutes of quiet in the way quiet comes after a storm, when everyone knows the rain has stopped but no one dares say the storm has passed. The Meridian bar slowly loosened, little by little. A small laugh from the table of 3 young women returned, cautious at first, then gradually more natural. The construction workers ordered more beer. The old veteran still sat at his table, but his hand was no longer clenched on his thigh. The middle-aged couple began speaking again, softly, as if too much volume might call trouble back. Pauline poured Josie a glass of water and stood beside her behind the bar, saying nothing, only standing there, the way women who had lived long enough knew that sometimes presence was enough. Josie drank the water, one small sip at a time. Her hand was still trembling, but less than it had 15 minutes earlier. In her other hand, she held the locket in her palm, her fingers closed around it, as if she were afraid that if she let go, it would disappear. The bar began to breathe again. Maybe tonight would only be a bad night and then pass, the kind of night you told someone about the next morning, before both of you shook your heads and said, "Thank God nothing worse happened." Maybe the man in the expensive shirt would not come back. Maybe it was over. Then Josie's cell phone vibrated on the counter. It was only a small vibration, but in the still fragile air of the Meridian bar at that moment, it sounded like a knock on the door at midnight. Josie looked down at the screen. Unknown number. No name. No familiar area code. Only a string of numbers she had never seen before. She hesitated for 1 second, then answered, maybe out of habit. Maybe because she had grown used to unknown calls always being connected to her, whether she wanted them to be or not. The voice on the other end was male, polite, warm, the kind of voice that belonged to a television host or a church pastor, the kind of voice trained to make you feel safe before you realized you were not safe at all. "Miss Morrow," the voice said, "I hear there was a little misunderstanding tonight between you and one of my associates. I'd like to meet you in person and resolve it. I think when 2 adults sit down and talk, everything becomes much simpler." A pause, long enough for Josie to feel the weight of what was coming. "I'm outside in the parking lot." Josie did not ask who he was. She didn't need to ask. She knew, not because she had met him, but because of instinct. Because of the way that voice carried an authority Dutton did not have. Because Dutton was the dog, and this voice was the dog's master. Josie looked out the bar window. In the parking lot, under the dim yellow streetlight, a black SUV sat motionless, headlights shining, and beside it stood the shadow of a man, straight-backed, hands in his pockets, calm, patient, like someone who already knew the answer and was only waiting for it to be spoken. Hugh Pendleton did not enter the bar. He didn't need to enter. He didn't need to drag anyone, didn't need to grab anyone's wrist, didn't need to push anyone into a wall. He only needed to make 1 phone call and stand waiting, because Pendleton understood something Dutton was too stupid to understand. You did not need to drag a victim to your side if you knew how to make that victim walk to you on her own. Create enough pressure, close enough doors, take away enough things, and eventually they would walk, on their own 2 feet, to exactly where you wanted them to go. That was the tactic, and Pendleton had used it 100 times on 100 people like Josie. Josie ended the call. She set the phone down on the counter, and Pauline saw her face. Something in Josie's eyes had changed. Not more frightened and not calmer, but something empty. The kind of emptiness of someone who had given up the fight and accepted that the current was stronger than she was. Josie rose from the stool and began walking toward the door. Pauline watched her, needing 1 second to understand what was happening, then called out, urgent but trying to stay quiet. "Josie, don't." Josie did not stop. Her feet moved steadily, her eyes fixed straight ahead on the wooden door, and there was something in the way she walked that made Pauline want to cry, because those were not the steps of someone being forced. They were the steps of someone who had abandoned hope, and that was far more frightening. But halfway to the door, Josie's right hand touched the pocket of her apron, where the broken locket lay. Her fingers closed around it, and her steps slowed. 1 beat, only 1 single beat, but that beat was enough. Because when Josie looked up again, Barrett Ashford was standing at the threshold. He was not looking at her. He stood there, filling the doorway with his broad shoulders, his eyes fixed on the parking lot, staring straight at the black SUV and the figure standing beside it. Josie stopped behind him, and for the first time in the 15 minutes of false quiet that had just passed, she understood that tonight was not over. It had only just begun. Barrett stepped across the threshold of the Meridian Bar and out into the parking lot, alone. He did not look back at Josie, did not tell her to stay, did not signal Pauline to watch over her. He only walked out, and the wooden door closed behind him with a thin little jingle of the bell, fragile in the night. The headlights of the black SUV shone straight at him the moment he stepped out from under the porch roof, the white glare swallowing his figure whole, then throwing it behind him into a long shadow dragged across the asphalt of the parking lot. Barrett did not squint, did not lift a hand to shield his eyes, did not slow his pace. He walked straight into that light like a man used to entering places where light was used to blind, not to guide the way. Hugh Pendleton stood beside the driver's side door, one hand in his pants pocket, the other holding a phone with the screen turned off. 55 years old, salt and pepper hair combed smoothly back, thin gold-rimmed glasses, a pale gray cashmere sweater, expensive without being showy, the kind of expensive worn by a man who did not need anyone to know what his clothes cost, because he knew real power did not need advertising. He had a smile, the smile he had polished smooth through 30 years of climbing from nothing to everything, the kind of smile that made you feel welcomed before you realized you were being measured. Beside Pendleton, 2 large men stood still, their coats unbuttoned, not because of the weather, but because what was beneath those coats needed to be seen. And slightly behind them, standing near the front of the SUV, was Deputy Sheriff Neil Grady, 45 years old, square-faced, straight-shouldered, a police badge glinting on his belt beneath the headlights. A real badge, not a real conscience. Barrett stopped about 5 steps from Pendleton, close enough for a normal conversation, far enough to watch all 4 men at once. He stood beneath the headlights in his dark suit and with eyes almost black. And in that moment, with the long shadow behind him and the white light spread across his shoulders, he looked like something the darkness had sent out when darkness wanted to speak to the light in a language of equals. Pendleton spoke first, his voice mild, friendly, the kind of voice he used in boardrooms, at charity dinners, in meetings he already knew he had won before he ever sat down. "I know who you are, Mr. Ashford," Pendleton said, giving a slight nod as if the 2 of them had just met on a golf course. "And I also know what business you're in. We aren't strangers to how the real world works. We're the same kind of men. I don't think there's any need to turn a small matter into a large one." Barrett looked at Pendleton, at the gold-rimmed glasses, at the polished smile, at the way he stood, with the confidence of a man who had never been refused by anyone he could not buy or destroy. "You don't know what kind of man I am," Barrett said. The sentence was not a correction. It was a truth, spoken in a flat voice, without the slightest threat. And because there was no threat in it, it weighed more than any threat could have. Pendleton did not blink. He changed tactics as smoothly as a man shifting gears. No jerk, no noise, only a clean turn in another direction. "Fine," he said, his voice still warm. "Then let's talk like businessmen. The Southeast is yours. I know that. I respect that. I've never touched anything belonging to you, and I won't start now. In return, you leave me alone with a few houses, suburban property, some old folks, legal paperwork, nothing to do with you at all. Everyone has their own territory, Mr. Ashford. That's how things work." He spread both hands lightly, palms up, the gesture of a man opening a door, and inviting you to step through. A reasonable offer. Clean. Beneficial to both sides. The kind of agreement men in Barrett's world shook hands on every day. Barrett was silent for one beat. A beat long enough for Pendleton to think he was considering it. Long enough for the smile on his face to widen by 1 millimeter, because he thought he was about to win. Then Barrett spoke, and his voice did not change by even half a note. My territory means no one gets dragged across the floor in my territory. You just violated that. The smile on Pendleton's face did not disappear, but it froze, like water suddenly turned to ice while keeping the same shape. And in the white glare of the black SUV's headlights, the two men stood facing each other on the asphalt parking lot of a bar outside Savannah, and both of them knew that the polite conversation had just ended. Pendleton did not need to signal. Grady knew on his own that it was his turn. The deputy sheriff stepped forward from the front of the vehicle, slowly, shoulders straight, every footstep carrying the weight of a man used to using his badge as both shield and sword. He stopped 3 steps from Barrett, close enough for Barrett to see the headlights reflected on the face of the badge at his belt, and his right hand rested on the holster at his side, not gripping it, only resting there, the way a man did when he wanted you to know it was there. Mr. Ashford, Grady said, his voice heavy and firm, the voice of someone used to reading Miranda rights and ordering people to face the wall. I can arrest you right here on 6 charges I can remember off the top of my head. No warrant needed. No need to call anyone else. Right here, right now. So I suggest you turn around, get in your car, and go home. He tilted his head slightly, looking at Barrett like a man who already knew how the conversation would end, because he had a badge, and the badge always won. The parking lot was silent. The headlights still shone. The 2 large men stood on either side of Pendleton, watching. Pendleton smiled behind Grady, the smile of a man who had just laid his final trump card on the table. Barrett was silent. He looked at Grady, looked at the hand on the holster, looked at the badge, and said nothing. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. 10 seconds of silence under the headlights in the parking lot of a bar outside Savannah, and those 10 seconds were the longest silence of the night. Longer than the silence when Dutton stepped on the locket. Longer than the silence when the old veteran was crushed down with 3 words, because this was the silence in which Barrett Ashford was weighing, leaving against staying. 6 charges. The man was not wrong. Barrett knew that. He knew what Grady could find if he wanted to find it, and he knew that a deputy sheriff with enough determination and little enough conscience could turn one Thursday night into 10 years behind bars. Then Barrett took the phone from his suit pocket, not hurriedly, not secretly, but slowly and clearly, so no one could mistake the gesture for anything else. He turned on the screen, scrolled through the messages, and Grady saw the blue light from the phone cast across Barrett's face, illuminating those dark eyes as they read something with the calm of a man reading a restaurant menu. The result from the call Barrett had made in the corner booth half an hour earlier had come in. The full file on Pendleton's operation, names, dates, money, accounts, and everyone connected to it. When Barrett controlled a territory, he knew everything that moved through it. Every suspicious call, every unusual transaction, every name appearing where it should not appear. That was not spying. That was operations, the way a landowner knew when a stranger had set foot on his land. And inside that store of data, already there before this, not because Barrett had been looking for it, but because his system collected it automatically, were the things Neil Grady never wanted anyone to know. Barrett looked up from the screen and stared straight at Grady. March of last year, Barrett said, his voice as ordinary as a weather report. You received $12,000 from an account in the Cayman Islands. In July, another $8,000. Same account, same transfer route. Grady's face did not change immediately. He tried to hold it, tried to keep the hard look of a man wearing a badge, but Barrett saw his fingers stiffen on the holster, and he saw the man's jaw tighten by 0.5 millimeter. Barrett was not finished. He scrolled again on the phone, tapped an audio file, and turned on the speaker. In the quiet parking lot, the recording played clearly, every word sharp. 2 voices. The first was Pendleton's, polite and mild, discussing the need to handle quickly some case. A name Barrett did not know, but was almost certainly some lonely old person in the suburbs. The second voice was Grady's. Clear as day. Impossible to mistake. His voice in the recording told Pendleton that he would make sure no one caused trouble, and that the paperwork would go through smoothly. 27 seconds of recording. 27 seconds enough to end Neil Grady's career, his freedom, and the entire rest of his life. Barrett stopped the recording. The parking lot fell silent again. Grady stood there, and for the first time that night, the badge on his belt no longer looked like a shield. It looked like evidence. "That clip has been in my system for a long time," Barrett said, putting the phone back in his pocket, his voice not threatening, only laying out the truth. "I never needed to use it until tonight. But if you want to arrest me, Mr. Grady, go ahead. Your 6 charges in exchange for my 27 seconds. You decide which side weighs more." Grady understood. Arresting Barrett tonight meant that recording would reach internal affairs before he even finished the paperwork at the station. He would not lose his badge. He would lose his freedom. Grady's hand left the holster and dropped to his side, quietly, like a man letting go of something he had just realized had never truly belonged to him. And behind Grady, for the first time since stepping out of the black SUV, the smile on Hugh Pendleton's face disappeared completely. Pendleton looked at Grady standing motionless with his hand hanging at his side, and he understood that a piece had just been swept off the board. The badge was no longer useful. That 27-second recording had turned Neil Grady from a weapon into a burden, and Pendleton was the kind of man who abandoned burdens faster than anyone. He did not look at Grady again. He looked at Barrett, and in his eyes, something was recalculating, rearranging, searching for another door because the one he had just tried had slammed shut. Then Pendleton found it. He always found it. 30 years in the business had taught him that everyone had a price. It was only that not everyone was paid in money. Some people were paid in peace, in keeping what they had built untouched, in the promise that their world would not be disturbed. "Mr. Ashford," Pendleton said, and this time his voice no longer carried the polished courtesy of a boardroom. It was more direct, more bare, the voice of 2 men speaking without the paint on top. "What do you get from protecting this girl?" He tilted his head, his eyes on Barrett with a sincerity so practiced it nearly looked real. "Who is she?" "A waitress. Minimum wage. Night shifts in a bar Google Maps barely bothers to show. She isn't your family. She isn't your partner. She isn't anyone to you." Pendleton paused for one beat, letting the words sink in, then continued. "But you, Mr. Ashford, you have an empire. You spent 20 years building it, brick by brick. I know that because I know the price of building something from nothing, and I'm asking you a very simple question." He looked straight into Barrett's eyes. "Is it worth it?" The parking lot fell silent. The headlights kept shining. The 2 large men stood still. Grady stood still. And Barrett Ashford, for the first time in this long night, did not answer right away. He did not look at Pendleton. He looked to the right, where his car sat parked 10 steps away. A dark car, engine off, facing the road that ran straight into the darkness. 10 steps. 10 steps would be enough. All he had to do was turn around, take those 10 steps, open the car door, and drive away. The dark road would swallow him in 30 seconds, and tonight would become another Thursday night, when he drank whiskey and went home. His empire would remain intact. Everything he had built would still stand. No charges, no risk, no involvement. A strange girl in a bar outside town where he only came to drink whiskey. She was not his responsibility. She was no one to him, exactly as Pendleton had just said. 5 seconds passed. 5 seconds in which Barrett Ashford stood in the parking lot under the headlights and truly considered leaving. Not because he was a coward, but because he was smart enough to know the cost of staying, and practical enough to know that he owed the brown-haired girl behind the bar nothing at all. 5 seconds. Then his eyes left the car and turned toward the Meridian bar. Through the dirty glass door, through the dim yellow light inside, he saw Josie. She was sitting at the bar, her back slightly bent, her head slightly lowered, and her hands were wrapped around the broken locket in her palm, holding it like the last thing still keeping her connected to the ground. And Barrett saw what no one else in that parking lot could see, because no one else had once been on the other side of that glass. But he had, a very long time ago, in another place, behind another pane of glass. He had been the one sitting inside with the last thing left in his hands, and someone outside had looked in and walked away. He remembered. He had never been able to forget. Barrett turned back to Pendleton, and in those dark, almost black eyes, something had changed. Not much, only enough for Pendleton to realize that those 5 seconds had ended, and they had not ended the way he wanted. "You're asking me if she's worth it," Barrett said, his voice lower than usual, not because of threat, but because what he was talking about came from a place deeper than any negotiation over territory. 20 years ago, someone asked that question about me, about something very much like the girl sitting in there, and the answer they chose was, not worth it. Barrett was silent for one beat. I still remember what that felt like. Every day. So yes, Mr. Pendleton, she's worth it. The headlights still shone. Barrett's shadow still stretched across the asphalt, but that shadow no longer looked like the shadow of a man considering walking away. It looked like the shadow of a man who had planted himself into the ground, and no one could pull him out. Pendleton looked at Barrett standing there, steady as a lamppost on the asphalt of the parking lot, and he understood that he had tried every door with this man. The badge was useless. The territory agreement had been rejected. The question of, is it worth it, had been thrown right back in his face. Hugh Pendleton was used to winning with patience, with politeness, with giving his opponent enough rope to hang himself. But Barrett Ashford took rope from no one, and when a man like Pendleton ran out of patience, he did not lose his temper. He gave an order. He turned to the two large men who had stood still all night like two shadows that knew how to breathe, and he said, his voice brief, clean, without one wasted word, "Go inside. Bring the girl out." The two men did not ask again. They did not nod. They only turned and walked toward the door of the Meridian Bar, shoulders side by side, their footsteps heavy on the asphalt. Barrett stood there and watched them pass him. He did not step in their way, did not reach out a hand, did not say a word. He let them pass, let them push open the wooden door, let the bell on the door jingle, and let them step inside the bar where 15 people were sitting. Pendleton looked at Barrett, a little surprised, perhaps for the first time that night. "I thought you'd stop them," he said. Barrett did not look at him. He looked through the glass door of the bar, looked inside, and waited, because Barrett Ashford understood something Hugh Pendleton would never understand. You could not save a room by standing in front of that room forever. There would come a time when you were not there. There would come a time when the door opened, and you were on the other side of the city. And if that room could not stand up for itself, then it would always need someone standing in front of the door. Barrett did not stop the two men from entering, because he wanted to know the answer to a question he had carried with him his whole life. When no one was standing in front of the door, what would the room do? Inside the Meridian Bar, the two men stepped in, and everything changed again. The small laughter stopped dead. The construction workers lowered their glasses. The three young women huddled closer together. The middle-aged couple held hands beneath the table. The old veteran looked up from his drink, and his eyes recognized at once that these were not the kind of customers who came through a door to ask for directions. The two men moved toward the bar, toward Josie, their steps steady, not hurried but not slow, the footsteps of men who had done this many times and did not need to think about it. Josie sat at the bar, watching the two men come toward her, and she did not run. Not because she was brave, but because she no longer knew where to run. Every door had been closed. The keys to her house were in Dutton's pocket. The papers to the house were in the hands of someone whose face she did not know, and the broken locket lay in her hand like the last thing in the world that still belonged to her. Then the thing no one in the Meridian Bar expected happened. Pauline stepped out from behind the bar. She did not run. She did not charge forward. She simply stepped out, crossing the empty space between the bar and the rest of the room, and stood in front of Josie. 58 years old, more than half her hair gray, her apron stained with coffee, the heels of the slippers she had worn through 20 years behind the counter worn down. Her hands were shaking, clearly shaking so much that everyone could see it, but her feet did not move. She stood there, between two men twice her size and the small girl behind her, and she said, her voice trembling but every word clear, "If you want to take her, you'll have to step over me." The Meridian Bar went silent, the kind of silence where you could hear the ceiling fan turning, hear the ice melting in glasses, hear every person breathing. The two men looked at Pauline, looked at the 58-year-old waitress with shaking hands and steady feet, standing in their way, and they stopped, not because she was frightening, but because they were not being paid to knock down an old woman. 5 seconds passed. No one else moved. 5 seconds in which Pauline stood alone, and those 5 seconds must have felt as long as her whole life. Then came the sound of a chair dragging across the tile floor. The old veteran stood up. Slowly, his joints audible in the silence, both hands braced on the table to push his old body out of the chair. For the second time that night, he tried to stand. The first time, earlier in the evening, he had said, "Hey, you don't get to do that," and had been crushed down by 3 words. He had sat down then, sat down with his hand clenched on his thigh and a shame he would carry with him until he died. But this time, when he saw Pauline standing alone, hands shaking, feet steady, something inside that old man in the veteran's cap refused to sit down again. He stood straight. He said nothing. He only stood there beside his table, his veteran's cap slightly crooked, his back slightly bent but both feet on the ground. And this time he did not sit down. Then one of the construction workers by the window stood. He was tall, broad-shouldered, cement dust still on his pant legs, and he stood without saying anything, just stood. Then another man. Then one more. Not everyone. The middle-aged couple remained seated, their faces pale, their hands locked tightly together beneath the table, but neither of them stood. While one of the 3 young women was still curled under the table with eyes shut tight, a total of 8 people stood up. 8 ordinary people. None of them powerful. None of them armed with authority. None of them holding a badge or a recording that lasted 27 seconds. 8 strangers stood in an uneven, crooked line, trembling and afraid, between Hugh Pendleton's 2 men and a 27-year-old waitress, holding a broken locket at the bar behind them. Josie saw all of it from behind the bar. She saw Pauline step out, the 58-year-old bartender she had worked beside every night for the past 2 years, the woman who wiped glasses with an old towel and asked her small, gentle questions Josie never answered fully, the woman Josie had always thought of as only a co-worker, now standing in front of her with shaking hands and steady feet. She saw the old man in the veteran's cap, the man who had been crushed down earlier in the night with 3 cold words, standing for the second time beside his table, his back bent but his shoulders straight, and this time he didn't sit down. She saw the construction worker, cement dust on his pant legs, fists clenched at his sides, standing like a post. She saw the faces of people she had served drinks to all night without remembering their names, complete strangers she knew only by the beer they ordered or the table where they sat, standing between her and danger, standing between her and 2 men twice the size of any of them, standing for her, a night shift waitress whose name they did not know. And Josie realized, there, in that moment, that she had been wrong. She had been wrong her entire life. She had always believed she was invisible, that no one saw her, no one cared, that she was only a shadow moving lightly through a room and the world would not change whether she was there or not. She had believed that since her father left, since Caleb lay in a hospital bed for the last time and no one heard her call for a doctor, since her mother closed her eyes in a quiet room and Josie sat alone beside the bed with no one holding her hand, she had spent her whole life shrinking herself, walking away when she was pushed out, signing papers when she was threatened, stepping out the door when someone called from the parking lot, because that was what she knew how to do. That was how she survived, by making herself smaller, 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 until no one bothered to aim at her anymore. But tonight, 8 strangers had just told her with their feet that she was not invisible, and that changed everything. Josie stood up from the stool. Her hand still held the broken locket, but her other hand, the empty one, reached forward. She stepped out from behind the bar, crossed the space Pauline had crossed before her, and stood beside the older woman. Beside her, not behind her. Her hand took Pauline's, and Pauline squeezed back, tightly, the kind of hand clasp between 2 strangers who had just become something more than that. The 2 of them stood side by side, the 58-year-old bartender and the 27-year-old waitress, hand in hand, and Josie looked straight into the eyes of the 2 men standing 5 steps away from her. She spoke. Her voice trembled, clearly trembled, but every word was as clear as a blade cutting glass. "If you want to take me, then take me, but I won't walk out on my own anymore." She paused for one beat. "I've been walking out on my own my whole life." That sentence hung in the air of the Meridian bar, and it was not a threat, not a challenge. It was the declaration of someone who had just decided that enough was enough, that she had made herself small enough, that she had walked through enough doors. The 2 men looked at Josie, looked at Pauline, looked at the old veteran, looked at the construction worker, looked at 8 ordinary human beings standing straight and staring back at them. And they understood one very simple thing. Knocking down one person was easy, but looking into the eyes of 8 people standing upright and choosing not to look away was something else entirely. That was not the fight they were being paid to fight. One of the 3 young women at the center table, the girl who had spent the whole night taking selfies and laughing, had called 911 at some point without anyone knowing. The phone pressed to her ear, her voice whispering, but her hand did not shake. The friend beside her lifted her phone, camera on, the tiny red light blinking, recording everything. The two men saw the phone, saw the red light, and that was the final drop. They looked at each other, and in the quick exchange between their eyes, there was a brief negotiation that needed no words. Not worth it. They stepped back. One step, then two. Then they turned and walked out the door of the Meridian bar, the bell jingling behind them, soft and ordinary, as if nothing had happened. Outside in the parking lot, Hugh Pendleton watched the door of the Meridian bar open and his two men step out, empty-handed. No girl. Nothing but two lowered faces and the hurried footsteps of men who had just lost a fight they did not know how to lose. The two men walked straight toward the SUV, not looking at Pendleton, not explaining, not stopping. And in the way they avoided his eyes was the answer to every question he had not yet had time to ask. Pendleton's face changed, not in the way anger flared up, but in the way someone pulled thread after thread from a web he had been weaving all night, and he was watching it come apart strand by strand. Barrett still stood there. Same place, same posture, his shadow still stretched across the asphalt beneath the headlights, and nothing on his face had changed. No triumph, no smile, only the calm of a man who had known this would happen. "Do you want to know why I didn't stop those two from going inside?" Barrett said, his voice still flat like every sentence he had spoken tonight. Pendleton did not answer, but his eyes narrowed behind the gold-rimmed lenses, and Barrett knew he was listening. "Because I knew something you didn't know," Barrett said. He took the phone from his suit pocket, turned on the screen, and turned it toward Pendleton. On the screen was a message, brief, from an unnamed number, confirming that the entire file on Hugh Pendleton's operation, every transaction, every account, every forged contract, every fraudulent signature, had been sent to the federal prosecutor's office 20 minutes earlier, through an intermediary attorney, anonymous. Barrett Ashford's name was nowhere in that file. No trace, no thread leading back to him, because Barrett Ashford did not exist in the world of paperwork. He existed in the world paperwork could not touch, and from that world he could send anything anywhere without anyone knowing who had sent it. Pendleton looked at the phone screen, and for the first time that night, perhaps for the first time in years, his face had no expression left to use. He had run out of masks. Barrett put the phone away. "And there's one more thing," he said. "Did you know the Meridian bar has a cook?" Pendleton did not understand the question. Barrett did not need him to understand, because the answer was not for him. It was for everything that would happen after tonight. Inside the Meridian bar, behind the kitchen door with the small round glass window no one ever noticed, Kenny, 22 years old, the night shift cook, the kid who made TikTok videos and always carried his phone in his pocket, had been standing there since the beginning of the evening. From the moment Dutton slid the envelope across the counter, from the moment Josie tore the photograph, from the moment the locket fell to the floor, from the moment Pauline stepped out to block the way, and 8 strangers stood up. Kenny had lifted his phone, pressed it to the glass window in the kitchen door, and recorded. No one told the kid to record. No one knew he was recording. He was 22, raised in an age when the first reflex upon seeing something unusual was to lift a phone. And that reflex, tonight, inside the Meridian bar, had become more important than any badge or any 27-second recording. Everything was on Kenny's phone, the entire scene inside the bar. Dutton threatening Josie, Dutton taking the keys, the locket beneath his heel, the 2 men walking in and being stopped by 8 people, Josie standing up and taking Pauline's hand. Every second, every minute, every face, clear beneath the yellow lights of the Meridian bar. There was no video from the parking lot. No one recorded Pendleton's confession or Grady pulling his badge to block the way. But it wasn't needed. The anonymous file sent to the prosecutor would handle that part. And the statements of the 15 witnesses sitting inside the bar, the people who had just watched Pendleton's 2 men enter the bar intending to take a girl away, would handle the rest. Then, in the night, from far off, soft at first and then growing louder, clearer, came the sound of police sirens. Barrett heard them, Pendleton heard them. Grady, still standing like a statue near the front of the vehicle with his hand hanging at his side, heard them more clearly than anyone, because he knew exactly what those sirens meant. Red and blue lights appeared at the end of the road, distant but coming closer, and with each passing second they grew a little larger, a little clearer, a little nearer. Hugh Pendleton stood in the parking lot and watched his world collapse in the reverse order of how he had built it. The police sirens grew louder by the second, the blue and red lights flashing at the end of the road now bright enough to light up the line of trees along the roadside. And Pendleton understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had played long enough to know when the game was over, that he had not been brought down by a fist, not by a moral speech, not by a lonely hero standing up for what was right. He had been brought down by someone who played the same game he did, someone who spoke the same language of power, someone who understood the same machinery, but who had one thing he didn't have: a line. And that line, tonight, was what had split this parking lot into two sides: the side of the man with limits, and the side of the man without any, and the side without limits was losing. Grady reacted first, the survival instinct of a rat smelling rising water. He said nothing to Pendleton, did not look at Barrett, did not remove his badge, made no dramatic gesture at all. He only turned, walked quickly toward the patrol car parked in the far corner of the lot, opened the door, got in, and started the engine. His taillights blinked red, then vanished onto the main road within 10 seconds. The badge was still on his belt, but it couldn't save him anymore, and he knew it. And the way he drove off into the night, hurried, and not looking back, was the way people used to living in darkness run when the lights come on. The two hired men followed right after. They opened the rear door of the SUV, but Barrett stepped forward once and said, briefly, without raising his voice, "Walk." The two men looked at each other, looked at Barrett, looked at the blue and red lights growing larger at the end of the road, and decided the SUV wasn't worth arguing over. They left the vehicle behind, stepped into the darkness between the two buildings beside the parking lot, and disappeared as if they had never been there. Pendleton stood alone, under the headlights of his own SUV, in his pale gray cashmere and gold-rimmed glasses. He looked smaller than he had when he stepped out of the vehicle 20 minutes earlier. Inside that SUV, on the back seat, lay a brown leather briefcase. Barrett had seen it through the window from the moment Pendleton arrived, had seen the way it bulged with too many papers inside, and he knew what it was before anyone opened it to confirm, because people did not bring a leather briefcase full of documents to a bar parking lot at 10 o'clock at night unless those documents needed to be signed that same night by someone who had no other choice. Inside that leather briefcase was not only Josie Morrow's file, there were dozens of other contracts, deeds of transfer, powers of attorney, trembling signatures from people Pendleton and Dutton had found across the outskirts of Savannah, lonely people, old people no one visited anymore, people who had just lost loved ones and were still stunned from the funeral when someone knocked on the door with a polite smile and a stack of pre-printed papers. "Step away from the vehicle," Barrett said, "and leave everything inside." Pendleton looked at Barrett, looked at the blue and red lights now close enough that he could hear the police tires on the road, looked at the leather briefcase on the back seat of his own vehicle, the briefcase holding the entire machine he had spent years building, a machine that fed on people who had no one to protect them, one signature at a time, one house at a time, one life at a time, and he understood that the game was over, not with a punch, not with a gunshot, but with police sirens in the distance and a man in a dark suit standing still in the middle of the parking lot with nearly black eyes that did not blink. Pendleton stepped away from the vehicle. He did not run like Grady, did not vanish into the dark like the two hired men. He stepped out, back straight, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses with one finger, and stood there waiting. Because Hugh Pendleton was the kind of man who kept his posture, even when everything collapsed. Not because he was brave, but because he did not know any other way. The police cars stopped at the entrance to the parking lot. Blue and red lights swept across the asphalt, across Pendleton's face, across the black SUV, across Barrett's shadow where he had stepped back into the dark beyond the reach of the lights, quiet as darkness itself. Pendleton was handcuffed beneath the parking lot lights of the Meridian Bar, the bar he had thought he owned 2 hours earlier, and now he owned nothing except the steel cuffs around his wrists and the jingle of the bar door as the 15 people inside began stepping out to watch. Inside the Meridian Bar, the blue and red lights from the police cars slipped through the windows, sweeping slowly across every face, every wall, every table, and the room exhaled. Not the relieved exhale of people who had just escaped danger, but a deeper kind of exhale, trembling, the breath of people who had just realized they had been holding it for 2 hours without knowing. The ceiling fan still turned, The television was still showing soccer that no one was watching. The background music still leaked from the old speaker. Everything inside the Meridian bar was exactly as it had been at the beginning of the evening, but nothing was the same anymore, because the people sitting there were not the same anymore. The old veteran was the first to move. He did not return to his table. He walked slowly, his joints audible in the new quiet of the room, and sat down on the stool beside Josie at the bar. He said nothing, did not ask whether she was all right, did not tell her where he had served or what the cap on his head meant. He simply sat there beside her in silence, and his presence next to her said more than any words he could have spoken. It was the language of people who had lived long enough to know that sometimes what someone needs is not comfort, but for another person to sit down beside them and stay there. Pauline wrapped her arms around Josie. She held her tightly, her hands still shaking, trembling from the aftershock, from the fear that was flowing backward now that the danger had passed. But she held on and did not let go. Josie stiffened in Pauline's arms for a moment, the stiffness of someone not used to being held. Then her shoulders lowered, and she melted into the older woman, lightly, the way an exhausted person finally allows herself to lean on someone. It was the first time all night that anyone had touched Josie without meaning to hurt her. The construction worker, the big man with cement dust on his pant legs, the one who had stood up and stood still through the confrontation inside the bar, bent down then and picked up the chair that had been knocked over when the tray of glasses fell earlier that evening. He set it upright, straightened it, and pushed it back into place, gently, carefully, as if putting one chair where it belonged was the only way he knew how to put the whole room where it belonged. The middle-aged couple, the two who had not stood up, the two who had sat pale, faced with their hands locked together beneath the table, while 8 others rose, quietly came to the bar. They did not say anything to Josie. They only placed a glass of orange juice on the counter beside her, then returned to their table, and in the way they lowered their heads as they set the glass down, there was something heavy, something they would carry home tonight and think about for a very long time before sleep. Not everyone was brave that night. 7 out of the 15 people did not stand up. 7 sat still, eyes lowered, hands clenched, and let fear decide for them. But that night did not need all 15. It only needed enough, and 8 people had been enough. Outside in the parking lot, Barrett Ashford stood back in the darkness beyond the reach of the police lights, watching Pendleton being put into the patrol car. The blue and red lights swept across his face, but no one saw him, and he preferred it that way. Barrett Ashford was not a good man. He knew that. The world he had built knew that. The things he had done to gain territory, power, and the last corner booth at the Meridian bar were not the kinds of things good men did. But that night, in the parking lot of a bar outside Savannah, the difference between Barrett Ashford and Hugh Pendleton was not who was richer, who was stronger, or who had more men. The difference was that Barrett had a line he would never cross, and Pendleton had no line at all. And that line, in the end, was the only thing left when everything else had been stripped away. The police finished their work nearly half an hour later. The patrol car carrying Pendleton was gone, the blue and red lights shrinking, then disappearing at the end of the road like a bad dream curling in on itself. One officer stayed behind to take statements, writing neatly, speaking with Pauline, with Kenny, with the construction workers, with the 3 young women whose hands still trembled as they handed their phones over for the police to see the video. Josie sat at the bar and answered each question in a thin, even voice, the voice of someone who had gone through too much in one night to have any expression left. She signed her name on the report, her other hand still holding the broken locket. And when the officer closed his notebook and told her she could rest, she nodded but did not move. She only sat there, looking out the window, looking at the parking lot that was now empty except for a few cars beneath the dim yellow streetlights. And she saw him. Barrett Ashford stood leaning against his car, parked in the far corner of the lot, beyond the reach of the lights, beyond the reach of the police, beyond the reach of everything. His suit jacket was rumpled, his tie loosened for the first time that night, and he looked tired. Not tired from lack of sleep, but tired in the way a person looks after carrying something heavier than his own body for hours, and only now setting it down. Josie watched him through the glass for a long while. Then she stood, stepped through the jingling wooden door, and walked out into the parking lot. The Savannah night air was humid and warm, the smell of asphalt heated all day still rising faintly from the ground. Josie stopped a few steps from Barrett, and the 2 of them stood there outside under the streetlight, with no bar counter between them, no glass door, No safe distance except the thin air between two strangers who had just survived the same long night. "Who are you, really?" Josie asked. Not in an accusing voice, not in a frightened voice. Just a question, straight and simple, from someone who wanted to know. Barrett was silent. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and between them was the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have seen each other in their truest moment. With no armor, no serving smile, no calm face of power, Josie had seen Barrett pick the locket up from the floor and clean it with the sleeve of his suit jacket. Barrett had seen Josie scream because her brother's photograph was under a stranger's heel. They had seen each other at the bottom, and no introduction was needed after that. "I've lived long enough around dangerous people to recognize one," Josie said, her voice quiet but no longer trembling. "The way you stand, the way you speak, the way everyone in that bar looked at you but didn't dare ask who you were. I know what kind of man you are." She paused for one beat. "But dangerous men don't pick up a stranger's locket and wipe it clean." Barrett looked at her for a while longer, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, only the shadow of one, the closest thing to a smile his face seemed willing to allow. "Maybe I'm a different kind of dangerous," he said. Josie nodded slowly, as if that answer was enough, and she did not need anything more. "Maybe the world needs that kind," she said. Silence returned between them, but it was not the awkward silence of strangers. It was the silence between two people sitting beside the same fire, without needing to explain why they both knew how to survive winter. Then Barrett added one more sentence. Only one sentence, his voice lower than anything else he had said that night, so low that Josie had to step half a step closer to hear it clearly. "I was once the child no one stood up for." He did not explain. Did not say what happened. Did not say who had failed to stand up, or when, or where. Only one sentence. 13 words. And those 13 words carried the weight of 20 years. Of every night, he had lain awake, staring at the ceiling, and remembering what it felt like to sit on the other side of the glass, looking out, while no one looked in. Josie heard that sentence, and did not ask more. She understood without needing to ask, because she too had once been that child in her own way, and there were kinds of loss two people did not need to tell each other about, because they had already seen it in each other's eyes long ago. Barrett reached into his suit pocket and took out a small business card. White, simple, no name, no title, no logo, no address. Only one phone number printed in black ink at the center, nothing else. He handed it to Josie. "If anyone touches you or that house again," he said. Josie took the card, looked at the number, looked at the empty space around it, and understood that the blankness on the card was not because Barrett Ashford had nothing, but because what he had could not be written on paper. She nodded and slipped the card into her apron pocket, beside the broken locket. Barrett pushed away from the car, stood straight, and adjusted his suit jacket by instinct. Even though it was so rumpled, there was nothing left to adjust. He gave Josie a slight nod, the kind of nod a person used to say goodbye without using the word goodbye, then opened the car door, got in, and started the engine. No promise to meet again. No, I'll come back. No romantic moment between two people under the streetlight. Only the low purr of the engine, the red glow of the taillights, and the car backing out of its space, turning, and heading toward the main road. Josie stood there watching. The taillights grew smaller on the dark road, 2 red dots fading, then disappearing around the final bend, and the road became only a road again, dark and empty and quiet, as if Barrett Ashford had never been there. But he had been there. And in Josie's apron pocket, beside the broken locket holding her brother's photograph, lay a blank white business card with no name. And those two things, together, in the same pocket, on the same woman standing in the empty parking lot, were all that remained from tonight. 3 months later, Josie Morrow sat in the 3rd row of a federal courtroom in Savannah, Georgia, and watched Hugh Pendleton being led away. He wore a different gray suit, not the cashmere sweater from that night, but the same kind of expensive, the same straight-backed way of standing, and even with both hands cuffed in front of him, he still carried himself like a man used to being served. But his eyes could not hide it. His eyes were empty. Josie watched him pass through the side door of the courtroom, and she did not feel satisfaction, did not feel victory, only lightness, the kind of lightness that comes when a person finally sets down something heavy she has carried for too long, without realizing just how heavy it was. Then she looked around the courtroom, and what she saw there would stay with her longer than any sentence the judge had just read. In the row of seats on the left, an old man sat trembling, both hands gripping his wife's hand, and when the judge declared the transfer contract for his farm void, he said nothing. He only bowed his head, and his shoulders shook, and his wife placed a hand on his back and let him cry. In the row behind him, a middle-aged woman sobbed out loud when she heard her name read from the list of victims. Her name followed by the 2 words, contract void, and those 2 words gave back to her the savings she had lost when she signed a paper she thought was payment for her husband's nursing care. At the back of the room, a young couple held each other tightly, the way people do when they have just learned they will not lose their home, that the little house they had bought with everything they had saved in life would not be taken by a signature they had not understood. Josie looked at each of those faces, and she realized she had not been the only one. Pendleton's machine had not only targeted her, it had targeted dozens of people across the outskirts of Savannah. Lonely people, people who had just lost loved ones, people with no one to check the papers for them, people who, when they signed their names on a paper Dutton or someone like Dutton placed in front of them, believed they were signing to receive help. But Josie was the first. She was the one who tore the photograph in half inside the Meridian bar that Thursday night. And because she tore it, because she screamed, because she stood up and took Pauline's hand, everything that followed had been able to happen. Neil Grady was arrested at a gas station, 40 minutes outside Savannah, 2 hours after he drove his patrol car away from the Meridian parking lot. His badge was still on his belt when they cuffed him. Craig Dutton was arrested the next morning at his own house, the expensive watch still on his wrist, Josie's house keys still in his pants pocket. One contract after another was canceled. One false signature after another was exposed. One house after another was returned to the person it truly belonged to. The machine Pendleton had spent years building to grind down the weak was dismantled in a few months, because that machine had been built on a foundation of silence. And once that silence broke, the foundation broke with it. 1 week after the trial, Josie came home to her mother's small white house, where the locks had now been changed back with new keys that she herself held, and on the front step sat a small package. A white paper box, no sender's name, no return address, only her name written neatly in black ink. Josie opened the box. Inside, resting on a layer of black velvet, was a new silver chain, the exact same style as the chain that had snapped that night at the Meridian bar. The same length, the same clasp, no card, no message, no name. Josie lifted the chain, and she did not need to see a sender's name to know who had sent it, because in this world there was only one person who had picked up her broken locket from the bar floor, wiped it clean with the sleeve of his suit jacket, and placed it on the counter without looking at the photograph inside. Josie Morrow opened the door of her mother's small white-painted house that evening, the new key in her hand, and when the door opened, the familiar smell rushed toward her, the smell of old wood, the smell of curtains washed with the cheap soap her mother had used for so many years, the smell of a house that had waited a very long time for her and was still here now. Josie stepped inside, turned on the hallway light, and warm yellow light poured through the narrow space, falling across the walls she had looked at since she was so small she had to stand on tiptoe to reach the light switch. On the wall across from the staircase, exactly where her mother had chosen years earlier, because it was the first thing you saw when you walked into the house, hung a family photograph. Her mother stood in the middle, smiling wide, her hands resting on the shoulders of her 2 children. Josie on the left, 15 years old, brown hair still long and uncut, eyes bright in a way she could hardly recognize as her own now, and Caleb on the right, 18 years old, wearing a high school graduation gown, his square cap sitting crooked on his head, his smile so wide it almost did not fit inside the frame. That day had been Caleb's graduation, the day the whole family stood outside the schoolyard to take pictures, and her mother cried because she was proud, and Caleb teased her, saying, "Mom, it's weird to cry here," and Josie held the cheap bouquet she had bought at the corner grocery store, and Caleb held it like he was holding a championship trophy. No one in that photograph knew what would happen after that. No one knew that the boy with the wide smile would leave at 18, that the proud mother would not survive that loss, that the older sister would stand alone in this house years later, looking at that photograph and trying to remember what happiness felt like. Josie stood before the photograph. She opened her hand, and in her palm was the broken locket she had held onto since that night at the Meridian bar. She opened the face of the locket and looked at the small picture inside. Caleb's smile, The same smile as the one on the wall, but smaller, dimmer, worn smooth by her fingers touching it every night for the past 2 years. Then Josie did something she had never done since Caleb left. She stood before the photograph. The locket hung there, swayed once, then settled, Caleb's picture inside facing the hallway light. For the first time in 2 years, Josie did not wear the locket around her neck. For the first time, she did not need to carry Caleb on her body to feel that he was still close, because he was here. He was in this house, in these walls, in the graduation photograph on the wall, in the cheap soap smell on the curtains, in the way the hallway light fell across the wooden floor at night, in every corner, every room, every memory this house had kept. Caleb did not need her to carry him. He needed her to keep the house, and she had kept it. Josie placed her hand on the family photograph, touched her mother's face lightly, then touched Caleb's face, then lowered her hand and turned toward the kitchen to make tea, turned on the small radio on the shelf, and sat down in the chair by the window where her mother had once sat reading every afternoon. She sat there, drinking tea, and the house was quiet around her. But it was not the empty quiet of loss. It was the warm quiet of a place that belonged to her and to which she belonged. People ask what courage looks like. Josie once thought it looked like a tall man in a dark suit, standing up from the last corner of a bar and walking out into a parking lot alone. But she was wrong. Courage looks like a 58-year-old bartender with shaking hands and steady feet stepping out to stand in front of you. It looks like an old man in a veteran's cap standing up for the second time in the same night, even though the first time had been crushed in 3 seconds. It looks like 8 strangers in a bar outside town choosing not to turn away. It looks like a 22-year-old cook raising his phone behind the glass window of the kitchen door without anyone telling him to. It looks like a young woman dialing 911 with a trembling hand while her friend lifts a camera and records everything. Courage is not a giant. It is a room full of small people deciding they have been small enough. This story is not only the story of Josie, or Barrett, or Pauline, or the old veteran. It is the story of the moment each of us must choose, to sit still or stand up, to turn away or look straight ahead, and whether the kindness in us is large enough to defeat our fear. The lesson here is not that you need to be strong. The lesson is that you only need to stand, even when your legs are shaking, even when your hands are shaking, even when you do not know what will happen next. Because when one person stands, the person beside them will see it, and maybe they will stand too, and then the person beside them, and then the whole room. You do not need to save the whole world. You only need to be the first person to stand. If this story touched you, if it made you think of someone in your life, a Pauline, a Barrett, or a moment when you wish you had stood up, please press the like button so more people can hear this story. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel to join us in the next stories. Every day, every week, we'll bring you stories that touch your heart in the way only truth and kindness can. We truly want to know how this story made you feel. What do you think about Josie, about Barrett, about Pauline, about the room that stood up that night? Leave a comment below and share the feelings from deep in your heart. We read every comment and treasure every word you write. Thank you for staying with us until the final minute. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace every day, and may you always remember that kindness is never a small thing. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.